Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome back to the Formed Book Club as we continue our discussion of The City of God by St. Augustine. I'm Father Fessio, joined by Vivian Dudro at her home and Joseph Pearce in his home. We ended actually with me quoting at excessive length up to and including the top of page 59. We're in the section on the meaning of creation. And I want to begin by a short quote from the middle of that page 59, where Augustine says, "For man was not created with his face pointing down to the ground like the animals that lack reason. Instead, the form of his body is erect and faces up toward heaven, admonishing him to take thought for the things that are above." That's actually the origin of the Greek word anthropos. Tropos means to turn and ana means up. And so the Greeks realized that the human animal was the one that was upturned, that faced the heights. So that's reflected here in St. Augustine. I want to move on to page 78, but I'm sure one of you has something before then.
I have just a short one-sentence quote that I want to just refer to at the bottom of page 62, unless Vivian beats that.
Well, I also underlined on that page, Father 59, toward the bottom, "Certainly we see nothing which was created in the body for the sake of utility that does not also have a place in its beauty."
Well.
And I thought that was... maybe it looked at too closely. It might be debatable, but but the point is that everything God makes is not just functional; it's also beautiful.
Like cockroaches?
Yes, I mean, if you think about it, if you met a cockroach, and you'd never associated it before with scurrying around in your trash or in your cupboards or whatever, and it was the sun was shining on it, and it was all its beautiful colors were seen, you would say that's a thing of beauty. But because we associate them with filth and garbage and scuttling around in the dark and everything, its beauty's lost on us. We're trying to kill them with raid or whatever. Like even a shark, watching. I mean,
well, they can be
they're
very
fearsome and terrible to look at. But
yeah.
What?
I mean, yeah, sharks can be very beautiful.
Yeah, but they're fearsome and terrible also at the same time. Or spiders,
right.
I mean, who doesn't run away from a spider? I scream every time I see one. But, if I actually took the time and to actually watch it make its web and glisten in the sun and all this, I would be mesmerized by its beauty. But, I just want to kill the darn thing. I don't want to contemplate it.
All right. On to page 62. Joseph.
Yeah, just the sentence, 4 lines from the bottom there. I just think it's a good aphorism that just needs to be highlighted. And that's what I've done. "Reason looks for what appears true to the light of the mind, while pleasure looks only for what gratifies the senses of the body." And again, I suppose that as with the previous discussion about utility and beauty, if we analyze closely, we could perhaps find room for discussion, because surely some spiritual things that are not literally not physical and sensual in that physical sense are pleasurable. All right, and a philosopher would actually say that the experience of the light of the mind is itself pleasant. So it really, the trouble with aphorisms is that we need to define our terms. Otherwise, they become ambiguous. And I think that's the problem there, that surely all pleasures are not sensual, unless we could talk about the IQ, the intellect, as being sensual in a different sense. Well, that's what I want to say on that.
All right. I mean, it's sort of hard to discuss an overall theme in this section, even though the meaning of creation does describe what's here. But it's sort of like a container for many very profound thoughts and expressions. And so, at least unless others have other ideas, I just want to kind of jump from one thought to another and comment.
Yeah, and that's what I've just done with that aphorism. I think that's the way to do this, because I think that this is a sort of anthology that von Balthasar has put together, and he's grouped them. So I think it leads itself to that.
Well,
There's something on.
Go ahead, Vivian.
There's something on 63 that I alluded to in our last conversation but I couldn't find the quote at the time, and that is down toward the middle, or God caused the temptations of the devil to work to the benefit of his saints, even though the devil's own desire was to do them harm. When God created the devil, then, he was by no means unaware of the devil's future maliciousness, and he foresaw the good that he himself was going to bring out of the devil's evil. And when we were talking last time about God's foreknowledge and free will, and Augustine defending God against the accusation that he's the source of evil. No, it's evil will, which is contrary to God, that is the source of evil. But this added thing that in creating everything, and of course for God there's no time anyway, there's no before and after and now and later in God, but everything he created was going to work out his good.
There is a now in God. There's a now, but there's not a later. That's right.
Right. That even the things that try to oppose God, in the end, do the good of God. And that's an important thing to remember. For my own good, it's good for me to remember that.
Well, he has something else in the next section on pilgrimage, which is very pertinent to what you just quoted here, but I'll wait till then to say it. But anything before 78?
Well, I've actually got 77, if I may.
Well, that's before 78.
It spills over onto 78, so if I start gate crashing your spiel, just let me know. But that on page 77, this new section, communion and decision in the spiritual realm. He sort of mixes up, in some sense, if you like, the angelic and the human by rearranging them in terms of the city of God, if you like, and heaven and hell. Ultimately, my aim is to indicate that we are justified in speaking not of 4 cities or societies, that is 2 of angels and 2 more of human beings, but rather of 2. One consisting of the good, the other of the evil, and each including not only angels, but also human beings. So I like the fact that you're basically saying there's really ultimately two destinies. Either we are going to be with God, and that applies equally to human beings and angels, or we're going to be away from God, and that also applies equally to human beings and angels. So rather than having 2 groups of angels and 2 groups of human beings, he mixes it up. And then I'm just going to, at the bottom there, I'm going to spill over to 78. You can stop you when you like, Father. I'm not going to speak for long on it. But for some, remain constant in the good that is common to all, which for them is God himself, and in his eternity, truth and love. Others, however, took delight in their own power as if they were themselves their own good. And these fell away from the higher good that is common to all, the good which makes blessed, and turned instead to private ends of their own. They exchanged the heights of eternity for the self-exaltation of pride, the certainty of truth for the cunning of folly, and the oneness of love for the zeal of partisanship. And so they became arrogant, deceitful, and invidious. I just love that, because it's so perennially relevant and true to every generation. I mean, those lines can be applied to what's happening in the Ukraine at the moment. They can be applied to what's happening in politics in any country, any moment, and really can be applied to our own lives and our own hearts. I mean, it's really axiomatic as opposed to an understanding of ourselves, and it's so succinctly put. Augustine at his best.
Well, Augustine, one of his many writings, which is famous, is his commentary on De Genesi ad Literam, on the literal meaning of Genesis. And this is kind of an expansion of what he says about the fall of man, the first sin of their own power as if they themselves their own good, you know. This is the temptation, the ultimate, the foundational temptation after the creation of man. But just below the middle of that page, he says, those creatures which are capable of happiness cannot attain happiness on their own, since they were created out of nothing, but only from the one by whom they were created. And Augustine comes after Athanasius. I'm not sure how much Athanasius he had read, if any, because Athanasius is writing in Greek. But I was fascinated when I was studying theology, and I was reading and doing a paper on Athanasius's De Incarnatio, the Incarnation of God, where I might have said this in a previous conversation we had, but it's worth saying again. The way Athanasius describes human beings is by a phrase. A human being is ha kata onta, the according to being. And so with Athanasius, you only have being on, which is God, and uk on, non-being, nothing. And then when God creates, what he creates is that which is according to being. That is, you're nothing in yourself. You're only, you must be dependent, because God could not create us as independent of him, because there's nothing to make us from, you know. So this is echoed here to me when he says that we can't find our happiness because we are created out of nothing, unless we find happiness from God, who's our creator. It's a very profound ontological truth.
And so in order to help ourselves avoid the pitfalls of pride and arrogance and from this delusion of our self-sufficiency, you know, on page 72, which is backing up just a little bit, but Augustine says in the middle there, it is certainly true that we can never thank him enough for the fact that we exist, that we have life, that we behold heaven and earth, that we have mind and reason by which to seek him, the very one who created all these things. So in other words, the regular practice of gratitude, whether you feel like it or not, is actually a very, very helpful antidote to pride.
Joseph, what is the Chesterton quote about the man is never so upright as when he gets on his knees, or something like that? Do you recall it? No. Oh well.
Not anything that's going to satisfy you. No.
All right. How about page 82 and 83? This was something which was I read most persuasively or illuminatingly in Joseph Ratzinger's book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, because it had to do with sacrifice. And, you know, I think if you say the word sacrifice, what images come up? You know, a heifer being slaughtered, or maybe turtle doves or something like that, the destruction of something, a libation, pouring out the wine into the ground. But Ratzinger makes the point, and of course he's very Augustinian. I mean, Augustine is probably his great hero in the history of Christian thinking. But Ratzinger makes the point that sacrum facere means to make sacred, to make holy. That is to give to God, to take something and then offer that back to God. And that's exactly what Augustine says here, page 82, talks about the sacrifice of worship. The true sacrifice, then, is every act done in order that we might cling to God in holy fellowship. That is, every act which is referred to the final good in which we can be truly blessed. So it's part of this exitus reditus, going out from God, coming back to God. It's a turning point. Page 83, 3 lines down. Thus, a person who is consecrated in the name of God, that means by baptism, we're not talking about religious, and is vowed to God, insofar as he dies to the world so that he may live to God, is himself a sacrifice. A few lines below that. Our body also is a sacrifice when we discipline it by temperance, if we do this as we ought for God's sake. And finally, 3 more lines down. How much more does the soul itself become a sacrifice when it directs itself to God? So this beautiful theology of sacrifice here is that we should make of our whole lives a sacrifice, which does not mean we should stab ourselves and bleed to death, but by turning back to the one who created us out of nothing, on whom we're dependent, without whose presence and power we cannot be happy. I mean, there's just so much in Augustine.
Yeah, I highlighted some of the same passages there. I mean, I like that our body also is a sacrifice. We discipline it by temperance if we do this as we ought for God's sake. I mean, this is Lent. It's a good time to be reminded of these things. But, that seeing our body itself as something which we should offer in sacrifice, and mortification as an act of doing that, I think really brings home the purpose of mortification.
Mm-hmm. And the whole spirit of the thing is, in fact, thanks and praise, right? I mean, that's the essence of the Mass, thanks and praise. And the offerings are given out of that thankfulness and knowing that we owe God everything. And so here we're giving a part of ourselves back, or our whole selves really back in the Mass, in thanks and praise.
That's what it's called, Eucharistia, thanksgiving. That's exactly right. I think it's good to point out here that Augustine has been accused of kind of a over pessimistic view of the body and of marriage and of sexual relations and so on. And people say, well, he was a Manichae, which was saw the body and anything of the earth as evil. But that's not this Augustine. I mean, he's talking about the body as being holy here. That is, when you offer it back to God, it becomes a sacrifice, a worship, an act of holiness.
And then farther down, I'm sorry, therefore since true sacrifices are works of mercy, whether shown to ourselves or to our neighbors, which are directed to God, and since works of mercy are performed with no other object, then we might be delivered from misery and become blessed. What is that famous line from the Psalms, or maybe it's elsewhere in the Old Testament, what do I desire? What kind of sacrifice, what kind of fast does God desire? The care of widows and the liberation of the oppressed and so on. In other words, somehow it's inextricably tied together that giving thanks and praise to God results in acts of mercy toward one another.
Yeah, it's the 2 great commandments, which are one commandment, love of God and love of neighbor. Joseph, I have something on the last page of this section, 86.
My next highlighted thing is 88, so go ahead.
Well, this will conclude our section then on the meaning of creation. It's a little bit long. Middle of the page, he says, and this is, I mean, how practical and relevant this is to world politics now and then. Thus, true justice is found when the one supreme God rules an obedient city, so that there is no sacrifice but to him alone. and where in consequence the soul rules the body, and all who belong to that city and obey God, and reason faithfully rules the vices in lawful order. Consequently, just as a single just person lives by the faith that works through love, so does the whole company and people of the just. This is the love by which a person loves God as God ought to be loved and his neighbors himself. Now, he concludes, but where there is no such justice, that is, a justice where the supreme God rules a city, not just a person, there clearly is no company of persons joined by a common sense for what is right and by a community of interest. And assuming that this is the true definition of a people, where this is missing, there certainly is no people, and therefore there is no republic. For where there is no people, there is no common good of a people. I mean, I don't think Augustine is promoting a state religion, but or the state to be ruled by the church or religion. But he is saying, if you have members of a group, let's call them citizens, who don't have the foundational common interest and common good of what it means to be a human being, that is, directing all things to God, then you're not a people. You're not a city. You're just a collection of not automatons, but autonomous persons,
A radical individualism. I'm not suggesting we pursue this because it's controversial, but I think that one of the problems of the Enlightenment is its placing of rights before responsibilities, and I think that what Saint Augustine is getting at here is that that being responsible for the common good, and that's something which should be in the heart and actions and sacrificial life, self-sacrificial life of every citizen, is what actually coheres and gives that cohesion to a people, as opposed to just a group of individuals who are at each other's throats and have to be kept in place by some sort of tyranny to stop them doing that. I mean, if you want to actually have a proper living culture that's not a slave culture, you have to have responsibility as the primary motive. And so whatever the creed is, it's being responsible for that and the common good.
That's right. But I want to go back to this point that Augustine is saying you cannot have a city at all unless you have a common sacrifice in his tent, meaning of sacrifice, that all that you have and all the goods that are there are used in such a way that they honor God and are returned to God in some form. So anything less than that is less a city.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty much the lot of most of us most of the time.
Exactly.
Because where is such a city? Where has there ever been such a city?
But it's not in the city of man. I think that's the whole point. That's
exactly.
What Augustine's saying here, that really, insofar as the city of God infuses and penetrates and maybe impregnates the city of man, the healthier the city of man is. But ultimately, the city of man is not the city of God and cannot be and will never be.
And hence that very poignant bargaining of Abraham with God. Well, if we can find 10 men here,
he starts with
will
40.
10 do the will 10 do the trick?
But that's that's why the Eucharist is meant to be the center of real civilization. And the 13th century did a pretty good job of trying to make that clear. That's why John Sr. loved it so much, because for him, the symbol of the 13th century was the monstrance with the Eucharist in it. But that is the source of the power, the centripetal power that will bring persons into a union of the true common good of sacrifice, proper sacrifice to the Lord. And as you say, Vivian, we're constantly trying to do that as leaven, as it were, in the loaf, but we don't expect, as you said, Joseph, that we're going to bring about the city of God here. In fact, that song used to, they may still sing it, but when I avoid places where they sing it, we will build the city of God. No, we're not gonna, it comes down out of heaven,
Right. Yeah.
Have we want to move on to pilgrimage?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got something at the top of page 88.
Okay.
If anybody has anything before that, do you, Vivian?
Nope.
Well, just the second line down, I just like this image. Thus, the will itself, or rather man himself, insofar as his will was evil, was, so to speak, the evil tree that bore these works as its evil fruit. St. Augustine, in his work De Doctrina Christiana, he actually, I love the way he talks about the way that Scripture is symbolic, that it has an allegorical dimension. And here we see that ultimately the evil fruit comes from us, right? I mean, God doesn't make anything evil, so that the actual fruit on the tree, whatever that fruit was not evil, right? The evil was in the plucking of it. In other words, the evil was in the evil will, which caused us to pluck it, which means in many respects, we are the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and we chose to pluck that evil fruit through our own malicious choice, and that's the problem. So I like the fact that we, as each human person, can be seen as that tree in the middle. And then where that leads to, towards the bottom of page 88, thus to abandon God and to exist in oneself, that is, to be pleased with oneself, means not that one immediately loses all being, but rather that one veers toward nothingness. And I love that phrase, veering towards nothingness. I mean, Golemizing, right? You basically, you're this good person made in the image of God, and every time you choose to yourself above God, you're veering towards nothing. You're becoming less real. And ultimately, again, the C.S. Lewis picture in The Great Divorce, ultimately you get exactly what you want by being just about nothing.
And this, again, is an echo of the Athanasian definition of man as the one who is towards being. And if you turn away from God, you go towards nothingness.
Yeah.
On that next page in the middle, he says, here certainly is the great difference that distinguishes the two cities of which we are speaking. One, a company of the godly, the other company of the godless, each including the angels that belong to it. In one, the love of God comes before all else. In other, the love of self. And as we've said many times before, it's not like we have boundaries that you can say, well, these are the red states and the blue states or something like that. No, we all have one foot in each city. And the struggle of the pilgrimage is to be walking towards the city of God and trying to extricate one as best one can from the city of man.
And the way we do that is through the virtue of obedience to God. So on the bottom of page 88, the proud are the willful. And it is good to lift up your heart, not yourself, however, which is due to pride, but to the Lord, which is due to obedience. So we've been talking about this movement of lifting ourselves up, of making this sacrifice to God. Well, it's obedience and not sacrifice I want, says God to Saul, right? And that's, of course, the hardest thing to do, because we are all by nature, from the moment we're born, willful. And we just want what we want. And we have all kinds of ways of justifying that what we want happens to be also the good or what God wants. So we're very good at deceiving ourselves and being deceived. But that is the clear thing and obedience can belong only to the humble. Surprisingly, then, there is in humility something that lifts up the heart. There's an allusion to what you were getting at, Father. In kneeling, we are taller or nobler, right? So this is what we need. We need humility and we need obedience. And that's what's going to make up whether your foot is in what place.
And
Can I sort of bring something which in the illustrious presence of Saint Augustine might seem almost sacrilegious, but I mean, one of my favourite lines from a rock song is that U2, the Irish band, that in mysterious ways, if you want to kiss the sky, you better learn how to kneel. I mean, there's the paradox. It's basically saying the same thing here, right?
I want to go, Vivian, you stressed obedience, and rightly so, but that can be twisted or distorted in a kind of a Kantianism where we do things because it's our duty, and that's the only motive for doing them. And there's a truth in that, but with Augustine, love is more important than obedience. He says on that new paragraph on page 89, two loves then have made two cities. Love of self, even to the point of contempt for God, made the earthly city. And love of God, even to the point of contempt for self, made the heavenly city. So that's...
Yes, obedience without love, if you're just obeying out of fear, that's the obedience of a slave. That's not the obedience of a free man that God made you to be. So you're diminishing your dignity if you're obeying out of fear. But obedience out of love, which is what Christ exhibits on the cross, the love of the Son for the Father, even to the point of death, this is the obedience that we as Christians are trying to participate in. I don't even dare say imitate because it's too much for me, but at least I can participate in Christ's obedience to the point of death in my own little ways when I'm being asked, whatever's being asked of me by God, to do so, whatever it is, with love.
But I do love the way that I mean, I don't read Latin. But I can only imagine how beautiful this is in the original, because obviously a translation, you lose something. And it almost, that sentence you just quoted, Father, I mean, it's so beautiful, even in translation, or two sentences. Two loves then have made two cities. Love of self, even to the point of contempt for God, made the earthly city, and love of God, even to the point of contempt for self, made the heavenly city. I mean, that's beautiful prose. Right, and it's a translation of something. So, I mean, to me, and it's all over the place. I mean, Augustine, it seems that every fourth or fifth sentence seems to be this just really succinct encapsulation of something aphoristically, which is profound. You know.
And, well, my Latin isn't that good. It never was that good, but it was good enough to read some parts of Augustine, and it is poetic. His prose, verges on poetry in the Latin, because of these juxtapositions which he makes.
I can imagine. Unfortunately, I can only imagine.
On page 91, there's something here which, to me, reminded me of C.S. Lewis in his book Miracles, and I'll explain what. The very top of the page is for the soul, and ... because it had by its own will deserted its Lord above, it no longer controlled its servant below by its own will. And Lewis makes this point beautifully, much more beautifully than my summary is going to be right now, but that, in the order which God created, all of creation outside of man was to be subject to, in material creation, subject to man, and man subject to God. And as long as we were subject to God, it remained subject to us. But when we broke that relationship with God, now we have to till the soil in the sweat of our brow, bring forth children with pain, so that creation is no longer obedient to us, precisely because we've been no longer obedient to God. And there it is in Augustine. I found this often by way of my long life. I find some idea that I got from myself or someone else, and then I later see it's in Augustine already. I mean, there's so much here. At the bottom of the page, different idea here. Thus, Christians who truly hold the Catholic faith are agreed that even the death of the body was not inflicted on us by any law of nature. That's St. Paul. Through the sin of one man, death came into the world. So that even physical death is a consequence of sin. That is a great mystery. which we probably don't have time to explore now or even ever.
Well, and that's related to that other point you just made about once we ruptured our relationship with God through our disobedience, now nature doesn't obey us, even our own nature. Even the good that we will for ourselves in our actions and our thoughts and our speech, in staying healthy and all this, we're constantly fighting a battle. It's like everything is opposed to the good that we want to do.
Amen. So I think we can stop here. Joseph, do you have any concluding comments?
No, I think you're right. I think obviously we've had our half an hour. I've got something on page 95, but it will wait until next week.
All right. So we'll see you all next week at the Formed Book Club. God bless you all.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Formed Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.